So now that you've seen Kelsey and James present their arguments, let's discuss each component of the arguments and discuss why Kelsey and James effectively conveyed those components to their listeners. I'm Professor Dimitri.
And I'm Professor Dutton. Why don't we get started?
All right. First, let's watch the beginning of each presentation and focus on the theme. Remember, a theme is a succinct and persuasive framing of the advocate's argument. It's the argument's initial focal point for the listener. Note carefully how Kelsey and James's themes have different focuses.
This case is about protecting a homeowner from an uninvited and unwelcome intruder who disrupted the homeowner's sense of security and safety in his home.
This is a case about a misunderstanding between former friends.
So Kelsey's theme was all about the defendant's really frightening intrusion. James, on the other hand, suggested that, what we had was just a misunderstanding between friends, or between folks who had been friends, actually. And you could see how each side then used the theme to kind of package their presentation of the evidence. Think about how that theme might have helped make each side's argument just a little bit more persuasive, how it might have helped put that evidence in a context for the listener.
Absolutely. So let's move to the next portion. Let's review the roadmap portion of the argument. Recall that an effective advocate uses a roadmap to give the listener a preview of the advocate's argument. Let's take a look at Kelsey's roadmap for the prosecution.
Snart is guilty of burglary for two reasons. First, Snart broke and entered Mr. Rory's house, which is a dwelling under Indiana's burglary statute. Second, Snart intended to commit a felony in that dwelling. More specifically, he intended to commit battery with a deadly weapon.
Yes, that was a really good job.
Absolutely.
She narrowed down her focus and she told us the two main points that she was going to make. And that really helps the listener then focus on and sort of know what's coming.
Absolutely. That's critical. So recall that after the advocate gives his or her roadmap, the advocate should give the listener a clear and concise statement of the law that the advocate is using to support his or her argument. Let's watch as James, in his argument for the defense, lays out the elements of the burglary statute and the further definition of one of those elements.
Burglary is defined by three elements. First, the burglar must break and enter a structure. Second, the structure must be the dwelling of another. Indiana common law defines a dwelling as a settled residence for a person and his or her personal belongings. In other words, a dwelling is a home. Third, the burglar must have the intent to commit a felony inside the dwelling.
All right, so after the advocate states the law, the advocate should next apply the law to the facts of the client's case. Remember that at this stage of the argument, the advocate should explain how the facts of the client's case establish, or fail to establish, the elements of the relevant rules of law. So let's watch Kelsey and James's argument regarding the intent element of burglary. Pay close attention to the different inferences that Kelsey and James urge the listener to draw from the relevant facts of the case.
Moreover, not only was the box cutter a deadly weapon, but Snart had every intention of attacking Mr. Rory with it because he had previously vowed to cut Mr. Rory if he ever saw him again. 2 weeks after this threat, Snart broke into Mr. Rory's home while Mr. Rory was there watching television. Fortunately for Mr. Rory, he spotted Snart in his living room, intruding into his residence, causing Snart to flee. Snart's covert entry into Mr. Rory's home, coupled with his flight upon his discovery by Mr. Rory, shows that he had something more in mind than merely retrieving an allegedly stolen watch. If Snart truly wished to retrieve this item, he could have simply called ahead of time or even asked the police to retrieve it for him to avoid any confrontation. Instead, Snart, who was still angry from finding out about Mr. Rory's relationship with his girlfriend, had no business being at, let alone breaking into Mr. Rory's residence.
However, even if the structure was a dwelling, Mr. Snart did not intend to commit battery with a deadly weapon inside of it. Instead, he was attempting to retrieve a watch he believed Rory had taken from him. This watch not only had monetary value to Mr. Snart, but was also sentimentally priceless because it was a gift from his grandfather. Although Mr. Snart had a box cutter in his pocket, he had just come from using the box cutter to open a package of knives that he was going to later sell through his business. And even if a box cutter is considered a dangerous weapon, Mr. Snart did not intend to commit battery with it. As soon as Rory discovered Mr. Snart in his home, Mr. Snart fled the scene. If Mr. Snart had intended to commit battery, this would have been the opportune time to brandish the box cutter and cut Rory. Instead, he removed himself from the situation because he was merely attempting to retrieve his beloved and stolen watch.
So this is basically, as Professor Dimitri mentioned, where the advocate makes those inferences from the facts. And you should see how Kelsey and James differently interpret the facts, while at the same time not misrepresenting the evidence or hiding facts, running away from any bad facts that might have been on their side.
Correct.
For example, let's talk about how each dealt with the fact that the defendant ran from the scene. So James suggested, hey, that's not a really bad fact. That shows instead that the defendant did not intend to actually commit the assault, right? Because he had all the things that he could have committed the assault with, and yet he didn't. Kelsey, on the other hand, says, no, the running shows consciousness of guilt. And he's fleeing the scene because the resident was right there, caught him in the act, and so he said, oh my goodness, I was going to do this horrible thing, and so now I'm going to run away. Element of surprise, right?
Absolutely. So finally, remember that an effective oral argument ends with a conclusion in which the advocate summarizes the points that she just conveyed and urges the listener to adopt the advocate's legal conclusion. Let's review James's conclusion.
Mr. Snart is not guilty of burglary for two reasons. First, the structure was not a settled residence because Rory was not using it as his home. And second, even if the structure was a settled residence, Mr. Snart did not have the intent to commit battery in the structure because he was merely attempting to retrieve his cherished watch. For these two reasons, the charges against Mr. Snart should be dismissed.
Okay, so now we've reviewed the 5 components of an oral argument, and the ball is now in your court. It's up to you to apply these components to your own situation.
And remember, these folks didn't just get up there and give these arguments. It pays to practice. This is the kind of thing that somebody has to practice. But also important is have fun.
Absolutely.